Hello, and welcome to the Politics of Gender, New Polities podcast, where we tell you what gender is and what it isn't. This is my guest, Maria. How you doing, Maria?
Hello.
We are continuing our, I think, a fairly difficult book club.
Yes.
Yeah. Sorry if you're struggling. Continuing our book club discussion on Judith Butler's Gender Trouble. And the reason that we're doing this, just to give you a sort of meta view, is that we really think that Judith Butler is a kind of perennial source for the challenge of queer theory, gender theory, and really just the social challenge of people denying the existence of any kind of substantive sexual binary and those various things that we often find troubling but don't really realize it has an academic source. So it really seems helpful to point to her. Not that she's the only one by any means, but definitely one of the heavy hitters that has inspired a lot of our social reality today. Fair?
Exactly, yeah.
Cool. You should move the mic a little closer to you. I'm
Thanks.
worried that people can't hear you.
Okay, so one of the places that we wanted to begin was just by remembering and reviewing the postmodern principles that we talked about last time, because again, when we're going through this text, a lot of it can seem really incomprehensible. You have no idea what she's talking about, but then when you remind yourself that this is the perspective that she's coming from, suddenly it becomes a lot more clear. So, I have these written down. So the first two things that we were looking at last time was this knowledge principle and power principle. So the knowledge principle is this radical skepticism that we can know reality as it is. And so that kind of is the background when you enter into this text, because one of the keys to understanding Butler, I think, is recognizing that she's not making any metaphysical claims. This is all
not on purpose, anyways.
Yes.
Yeah, totally.
Because she doesn't think that you can get to reality itself. The other principle was the power principle. And that's because we can't know reality. All that's left is power and our constructions of power into systems. And so what she's doing then is performing this genealogical critique, which is not asking what is gender really, but okay, we have this binary before us. What power produced it? Why?
Yeah.
Who is it serving? That's really what she's trying to accomplish.
Totally.
And then there were these four kind of commitments that go along with postmodernism. One was the blurring of boundaries, and that's, I think, this idea of troubling that she's talking about, why it's gender trouble, just to show that things are not as stable and clear as what we thought. The other is the power of language and how language actually builds our reality because it tells us how to think about it. The third was a cultural relativism, which we accidentally skipped over.
Did we?
Last time. We did.
Whoops.
And that's this idea that if we can't actually know the truth about reality, then all we're doing is constructing narratives, but who's to say that your narrative is right, my narrative is more right? It just ends up being all relative and coming down to power about whose narrative is right about the world. So you can't evaluate cultures. You can't evaluate narratives. There's no possibility of that. And then the last one was this loss of the individual and the loss of the universal. So she flat out denies universals, but then you also lose the individual a little bit in this cultural construction thing too, because you only start to really know your identity and who you are through the construction that you've come to realize about yourself.
It's a wild world out there.
So that's postmodernism in a nutshell.
There it is. And if you feel like we missed the truth of postmodernism, just remember it's all narrative anyways. So now, into the book. Chapter 1. I would like to show my hand a little bit and also trick you guys into buying something. I wrote this essay called What Judith Butler Means. I think it's pretty good, and it also shows my hand a little bit in terms of describing the consequences of Judith Butler's atheism. But I think potentially, as we go through this, reading this could be a good supplement, because sometimes when you're doing book clubs, you have this like aching question to ask, like, but what do you think? What do you think? When the work is really sort of descriptive, like, okay, I'm trying to get into what this person thinks, because there's no way we're going to come to a real truth without like going all the way down and getting into the heads of other people and then trying to come all the way back up. So if you want to read that, that is an issue 2.3 of New Polity Magazine, available at newpolity.com. Now, to business.
Business. So what we were thinking of doing with chapter 1 specifically is just going through all the different sections and talking about the main points that we think are worth highlighting.
Yeah.
As we go through.
Yeah, we're not really cool like leftists. Like they always do things like say they're going to review a book or something and then end up telling you the real meaning of the thing that's really their idea. We're not probably going to do much of that. This will be fairly boring.
So
should I say it's boring? You think that'll lose viewers? Have we just lost a bunch? Oh, shoot. Sorry.
Maybe.
Okay, chapter 1, or part 1 of chapter 1, women as the subject of feminism.
So I'm just going to go ahead and read the opening paragraph because I think it's very helpful. So she writes, for the most part, feminist theory has assumed that there is some existing identity, understood through the category of women, who not only initiates feminist interests and goals within discourse, but constitutes the subject for whom the political representation is pursued. Okay, so feminist movements have assumed that women exist.
Totally.
That is the category.
They're the ones we're going to defend.
So, what she ends up saying later on, recently, this prevailing conception of the relation between feminist theory and politics has come under challenge from within feminist discourse. The very subject of women is no longer understood in stable or abiding terms.
And let's be clear, I mean, she's writing this in 1991, right? But I think it is extremely, maybe even more relevant today than it was when she wrote it. I mean, the idea that there is not an agreement within feminist discourse on what a woman is not just like a coming problem, it is the problem in feminism.
Exactly. So what she's doing is moving from that and saying, okay, so it seems that within the feminist discourse itself, there's very little agreement, after all, on what it is that constitutes or ought to constitute the category of women. Therefore, we need to investigate this. This is troubling because the very category in which you are making your political moves is coming into question.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that she points out right away is that feminism is a political discourse, which means that it has a activity behind it. It's not simply airily reflecting on the philosophical truths of man, woman, gender, etc. I mean, it does that incidentally, but the point is that it has a deliberate and immediate social aim, normally expressed as the liberation of women from various powers of oppression, whether that's the patriarchy or expressed in some different way. But you can see the problem here, that the philosophical question starts to eat away at the political desire, right? Well, if we're for the liberation of women, but if we don't know who women are, what are we doing? And this has obviously become problematic within splits within the feminist movement now, where you have biological males identifying as women and then being a part of the representation of feminism, whereas for many people within who identify as feminists are nevertheless saying that they don't think that person is included within the subject women.
And so then she starts to take this genealogical critique move, beginning with Foucault. So I'm going to share page numbers for those of you who are using the PDF. But this is on page 2. Foucault points out that juridical systems of power produce the subjects they consequently come to represent. So if you've read Discipline and Punish, this is the idea of the, what's it called? The delinquent. So feminists assume that this category of women exists. And she writes, but the subjects regulated by such structures are, by virtue of being subjected to them, formed, defined, and reproduced in accordance with the requirement of those structures. The way that we understand this category of woman is from this political discourse that's happening. And so what she ends up writing is, and the feminist subject turns out to be discursively constituted by the very political system that is supposed to facilitate its emancipation. So if it's this discourse thing that has produced this category,
Yeah.
then why are we trying to use that thing that has created and suppressed the category to then emancipate that category that it itself produced?
Yeah, so whenever you, within the postmodern context, say, I'm going to call these things women, you're making some kind of arbitrary power move, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so for feminism to say, we're going to work for freedom and against tyranny by using this category that we're going to call women, is taking the same sort of arbitrary power, just trying to reverse it, or rather reverse its direction. And you can see this obviously in that for Judith Butler, it always leaves people out. So the category of woman, she speaks somewhere of the fact that there are women that say that they are not represented by feminism. So the very fact that there are women who are not feminists is itself evidence that the category of woman cannot be the subject of feminism. It has to leave people out. And this is I mean, you can see how this just follows from the postmodern problem, right? Is that okay, so the universe is just there for you to make meaning with according to certain structures that are available to you for the sake of your own individual ends, and so you do. But you can't do it in a way that's satisfying to everyone, because ultimately you're in violent conflict with everyone else in how your view of the world, how your language is imposing some sort of order on the real.
So one feminist response to this problem is that, well, what if we can figure out what woman is before the political discourse, before the law? But she questions that you can even come to know what woman is before that political discourse is even in place. So again, on page 2, she said, Indeed, the question of women as the subject of feminism raises the possibility that there may not be a subject who stands before the law, awaiting representation in or by the law.
And to be clear, like, her understanding of the law is that human power that mandates in a certain respect that things be seen in a certain way, understood in a certain way, lived in a certain way. It's a broader conception of law than like a positive. I think if you're not familiar with this postmodern stuff, you might be reading law in like a written statute sort of way. But
so basically what she's doing is critiquing what she calls the state of nature hypothesis, what she calls the foundationalist fable, which really has she's critiquing the classical liberal notion that there is an original state of nature of man. We can turn back the clock and see what man was like on his own.
Yeah.
His nature isolated from all of reality. And once we understand that thing, apart from all of the different impositions that we've put onto man, then we can start building reality and building politics off of that.
Yeah, and what she says is so wrong about this liberal view is that whenever you get to a state of nature myth, you're always describing something that is still obviously culturally constructed. That's still obviously you're not ever apart from like your linguistic, social, rational, historical world. You are using it, and this is why I mean Catholics are often very troubled by liberalism in this sense, because
Classical
liberalism, yeah, because I mean if you think about it, like if you look at any of the great liberal thinkers' state of nature myths, when they say like, okay, let's get back to man just as we know him in this kind of objective way, and then build all our political structures on top of that. So they just remove him from tradition, from the church, from history, and they look at him and then describe him. Nevertheless, the descriptions are obviously very contingent. It's like, well, he's an individual that doesn't get married, but only like relates to women for a certain amount of time before he. I mean, I'm talking about Rousseau's sort of savage myth. So they're describing something, but it's very obvious that it's for the purpose of building up a certain kind of society from that point.
They're trying to describe an original man.
Mm-hmm.
But even the attempt to get back to the original man, not everyone is in agreement on.
Right.
And so it almost just proves her point
It's
that you
just more
can't get
power.
to the original man. You can't get to the state of nature.
Yeah.
And I think in many ways we can agree with that. So you can't get back to I mean, we do get back to original man, but where do we find it? We find it in a narrative. We find it in Genesis.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. I mean, I think the need for the liberals to go posit some natural beginning, and then the need for the feminists to imitate that in positing a sort of natural woman, is, to my mind, very obviously a Christian residue. Like, we understand the world as being given through narrative, and we actually have based our world on our understanding of how man was created in the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
that's a thick tradition that you're not just gonna like ignore.
Exactly.
But Butler is trying to actually say, let's not do that either. Um, so there's no woman before her cultural construction as such. So what's the solution?
Okay, so you can't go back to this original woman before the state, before politics, before cultural constructions. And then she says that if one is a woman, and is in scare quotes, that is surely not all one is. The term fails to be exhaustive, not because a pregendered person transcends the specific paraphernalia of its gender, but because gender is not always constituted coherently or consistently in different historical contexts, and because gender intersects with racial, class, ethnic, sexual, and regional modalities of discursively constituted identities. So then what she's saying here is that gender, as it manifests in different historical contexts, is not all the same.
Right.
When you make the move to turn back the clock to find the original man, the original woman, people have different ideas, and so she's putting that forward essentially just to trouble the waters.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it seems like we're a little bit unstable.
Mm-hmm.
If this, I think, goes back to the cultural relativism principle.
Mm-hmm.
So you have all these different maybe cultural narratives or expressions of gender, but you can't evaluate them. You just notice that there's all these different ones, and so that further emphasizes the fact that for the postmodern, you can't really come to know the true one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's another sort of way out that she posits, not as what she believes, but just as a possibility for feminism. She says, is there some commonality among women that preexists their oppression, or do women have a bond by virtue of their oppression alone? So this is what I think is important to remember, that we're talking about women as the subject of feminism, which is a political activity orientated towards the liberation of women from an enemy, from patriarchy, or however that enemy is expressed. And this has really been a debate within feminism for a while now, and it's fascinating because one of the attempts at saying, like, okay, we can't have unity on the basis of a common narrative, we can't have unity on the basis of a category that fits everyone that wants to belong to it, but we can have unity on a common experience of oppression. And this is really interesting because it says, okay, the solidity of our political venture is now going to take its basis on our certainty about the enemy and not any kind of positive subject. So in sort of in more traditional terms, we'd say something like this, like they're giving up on recognizing any being that's in need of protection, that has particular goods that are due to it, and seeking justice for that being, because they're saying, well, I don't know being at all. All I have is, these constructions. So why not instead point not to a positive vision, but to a negative one? So what is a woman? A woman is someone oppressed in this manner. And so then there's been a lot of interesting conversations. Actually, I think they're kind of uninteresting, to be honest, but conversations within feminism where it's like, person X says, you're not a woman unless you've experienced this sort of sexism. And then person Y says, well, I'm a trans woman and I've experienced this form of oppression, so I belong within the category woman too, because we're both oppressed. And I think this is actually a little satanic. I do. Just a little bit.
What do you mean?
Sorry. Well, it's just like in the Luciferian sense of like your political work is war. There's no there's no good being sought outside of the destruction of a perceived enemy. And part of the difficulty of this is that it makes the category, the positive category, rely on the continued existence of the enemy that provides you with your common, well, oppressor that makes us all one. So you come to need the oppressor. And this becomes a sort of form of it's self-mutilation in some way, because you're, on the one hand, you want to be like against the patriarchy, against, whatever it is that's oppressing women. But on the other hand, if you ever win, if you ever defeat the enemy, suddenly the basis of the category of women dissolves. And
if that's all you mean
if
by
that's all you mean by it, if all you
by
have
women.
is within the postmodern context, you have nothing but a particular political goal, and you're just asserting a particular form of unity that comes solely from the enemy.
I mean,
think.
basically what you're saying is the will to power is satanic.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. And I don't mean it in like an alarmist sense. I mean, like when I look at what Satan does, what
Mhm.
Lucifer does, he's lost, right? He's a loser in the sense that he doesn't have any positive good to gain or protect. I mean, his work is enmity. His work is obstacle. I mean, Satan means adversary. And
So the unity comes in the fact that we have a common enemy,
yeah,
and
like what's
that
the unity
becomes
of
the
the demons?
identity.
I mean, they don't love each other, but they all hate a common enemy. So that's sort of where I'm troubled um, by this method. Um, but in fairness to Butler, that's not exactly where she goes. She doesn't say like, let's just. I mean, I think it's a consequence of what she does say, but it's not where
Hmm.
she goes in terms of a solution to this problem of like finding a universal subject of feminism.
Yeah. Although she does criticize this idea of finding unity in oppression, because she says that what ends up happening a lot in feminism is that you end up supporting a highly Western notion
Yeah, totally.
of oppression, and that's not the same experience for everyone across the globe.
Yeah.
And so, even within oppression, there's a lot of subdivisions, and so there's even more fragmentation. So, she's finding fragmentation within the category of like what constitutes women, and then she's also finding fragmentation within oppression.
Totally. Like when liberal feminists go like to non-Western countries and are like, "Don't worry, we've come here to give you your God-given universal right to abortion," and then the women there are like, "We don't want it." They're like, "Well, we're gonna make you want it."
So, more towards getting towards the end of that section, if we want to wrap up the first one,
Yeah.
she says, indeed, the fragmentation within feminism and the paradoxical opposition to feminism from, quote, women, whom feminism claims to represent, suggests the necessary limits of identity politics. So that's kind of a summary of all the things that we've been talking about before.
Yeah,
So,
she's not gonna find any kind of answer in identity um, politics, but she also says at the end that she does kind of offer this odd possibility for how to get out of this bind.
mhm.
When I'm just going to read the last sentence, if that's all right. She says, perhaps paradoxically, representation will be shown to make sense for feminism only when the subject of women is nowhere presumed. And I think we're going to see more of this going forward, but this is just this inkling of if Judith Butler has any kind of positive vision, it's somehow of
Not
everyone
presuming
agreeing
that categories are real.
they're not real. So like you can use them as sort of weaponry,
Hmm.
but you can't. But you kind of always hold them lightly and contingently. So
Exactly.
I'm using the term women that includes these people because that achieves my ends. But if someone else has a different, like, a different belonging to that category, it doesn't really bother me because I already know it's fake.
Yeah, I think there's another important thing in this section before we move on. So she makes the point that the juridical structures of language and politics, this is on page 5, constitute the contemporary field of power. So this is the way that things are. We have these structures of language and politics, and this is what constitutes our contemporary field of power. This is how the power dynamic is laid out. Hence, there is no position outside of this field, right? You can't go back to the state of nature, even trying to get there. You're still moving through the contemporary field of power, the contemporary language construction in order to perceive this original substance, so to speak. So the only thing that's left to you, because there is no position outside of this field, the only way to move forward is through this critical genealogy. And so she says that the critical point of departure is the historical present, as Marx puts it. All you can do is work with the contemporary field of power and move forward.
Yeah, and maybe one way of just really clearly saying this is like, right now, in the historical present, the word woman operates. It operates as a category.
Mm-hmm.
You might believe, and you might be right or you might be wrong, that it is an arbitrary construction, but the point is you have no other recourse in order to attain certain ends than to utilize power as it's been constructed, to utilize language as it's been constructed. So she's very much like creating a gap, saying like, look, we can know this stuff academically, but politically, just use it. Use the words. And I think that's literally what we see. I mean, you look at people, sometimes it feels a little bit like unreasonable, as if like there's a contradiction here, that the same institutions that are on one day saying like, woman is a social construct, on the other day are celebrating like International Women's Day or something.
Exactly.
And I don't actually think it's that much of a contradiction. I think they're just making the distinction that Butler is making and saying, well,
yeah, maybe they're actually consistent postmodernists. Maybe they're all just intentionally making a genealogical critique. Probably not.
Probably not. It's probably just different people running the Twitter accounts on different days.
Okay,
That's
so I think that wraps up the first section.
Okay, so thanks for guiding us through that. That was not boring, I found.
Oh, good. Okay.
Part 2.
Maybe we won't lose everybody. So the next section is called The Compulsory Order of Sex, Gender, Desire. Sweet. So what she's trying to do in this section is trouble this gender-sex distinction and the cultural assumption that we have that gender and desire follow from sex.
Yeah.
So there's one paragraph, it's the second paragraph, that I think is really helpful for understanding what she's talking about. So first of all, when she's talking about sex and gender, sex is just the body, it's the biological, and gender is the social construct. She doesn't think that there is substance. When she's saying gender, she's not talking about the possibility of actually being a man or being a woman or really being anything. This is just the cultural understanding.
Yeah, and she says it a few different ways, but probably the clearest to me is that gender is the cultural interpretation of sex. Sex is the anatomically differentiated body. And then gender within this context is what we make of it, how we express it. It's the cultural interpretation of sex. And she's going to go on to make that more difficult, but that's what she's starting with.
So she says, if gender is the cultural meanings that the sexed body assumes, then a gender cannot be said to follow from sex in any one way. And I remember reading that the first time and thinking that what she was saying was that gender cannot be said to follow from sex at all, but I think it is key that she says in any one way, and that's what she's using as leverage to trouble things. And so I think what she's getting at is that, okay, you have sex. We'll just assume that this binary is real for the moment. So assuming that there's this sex, we can see in different historical cultures that sex is manifested in different ways. Gender is manifested in different ways. It means slightly different things.
Totally.
Its roles are slightly different. And they don't even have to be radically different for her. All she's saying is that they don't always manifest in the same exact way.
Yeah.
So, if that's the case, her next sentence is taken to its logical limit, the sex gender distinction suggests a radical discontinuity between sexed bodies and culturally constructed genders. And so that's kind of where she loses me.
Yeah.
Or I find that not very compelling. Um, so if there's not any one way that gender always follows from sex, therefore it could manifest in any possible way. And I just don't think that's true.
Yeah, and in fairness to Butler, I don't think she thinks that either. It's just that she's kind of trapped within her presumption. So insofar as she bases further arguments on this, I think it's a genuine flaw. But she's also saying, like you kind of mentioned, like she's taking that, well, the sex body as a given. She's just presuming that, okay, we're going to say that there's this definite given of like a sexual binary in anatomy and genetics and biology. Yeah, but on the face of it, it's totally dissatisfying. Like, how on earth could you ever say that because a gender cannot follow from sex in any one way, that means there's radical discontinuity? I mean, when I think of what radical discontinuity means, I'm being kind of literal, like at root they are discontinuous. But the way I put it, I have a note here. I said the relationship of X to Y, where X is the cultural meaning of Y, is not a relationship of radical discontinuity. It's like if I had, the cultural interpretation of brunettes, and my interpretation could be wildly different than someone else's. Nevertheless, you don't derive from that a disconnect between the cultural interpretation of brunettes and brown hair, as if like this is somehow this,
Yeah, that it's free floating, and she
Well,
ends up
she says
using
that.
that
Yeah.
that word later on.
Yeah. She says when the constructed status of gender is theorized as radically independent of sex, and it hasn't been, so I don't know why she's saying that, but there you go. Gender itself becomes a free-floating artifice, with the consequence that man and masculine might just as easily signify a female body as a male one, and woman and feminine a male body as easily as a female one. So I think that if sex is binary in the assumption here, so there's sexed bodies and they are twofold in some way, then I don't think it at all follows that the interpretation of that fact is so free floating that you don't have a supervenient or like dependence of the interpretation on that given binary, like experience of the thing as binary. It's like, no, I just disagree. It's not the case that leads to, this fundamental detachment from sex and gender.
And the most charitable read I think I can give of that is that if she's being consistent with her postmodern principles, if you really can't get to know reality as it is, if that is impossible, then in a way there is a radical disconnect between the constructions and the reality. There's at no place do they actually meet. At no place do they actually touch.
Right. You might say something like, she has explained the possibility of, like the logical possibility of a disconnect between the cultural and the sexed body, but only because they're two different things. Like a cultural interpretation is not a fact of sex. But that's not really to say much, especially when you look at our history, which has been a largely coherent history of interpreting sex in ways that are directly related to the object of interpretation, that are limited by it.
So I think that what she's saying here, this radical disconnect, this gender as this free-floating artifice, makes a little bit more sense in what she's saying in the following two paragraphs, because this is when she's troubling the category of sex itself.
Yeah, this makes more sense to me too. She says, what is sex anyway? How often we've all asked that question. Is it natural, anatomical, chromosomal, or hormonal? And how is a feminist critic to assess the scientific discourses which purport to establish such facts for us? Does sex have a history? And then she goes on, if the immutable character of sex is contested, perhaps this construct called sex is as culturally constructed as gender. Indeed, perhaps it was always already gender, with the consequence that the distinction between sex and gender turns out to be no distinction at all. Okay.
I
Yeah.
think that that's the first time that I read it, I was just very confused how you could even move that far. But there's something else that she says down the line that in the next section that helps me to understand what she's getting at there.
Yeah, I've got another thing too. Do you have yours? I can.
Yeah, this
Okay.
is on page 8. There is no recourse to a body that has not always already been interpreted by cultural meanings.
Right.
So when we look at the body and we say that it is this sex, the reason why when we are doing that, we're already saying that within a cultural constructed meaning and language. Sex means something to us.
Yeah.
That's why we notice the category in the first place.
Yeah.
That's why we've given a name to it.
Yeah.
And we also seem to make this intuitive leap from having sexual characteristics to actually being that sex. And so I think that's what she is getting at, that there's no recourse to sex as just being a fact without meaning.
Yeah. There's no such thing as like brute facts. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
the point is that if you already come to the appearance of sex and anatomy and genetics and whatever with the understanding that gender is a cultural expression of that thing, then you cannot see sex alone. You can only see the thing that motivates this particular cultural expression, the thing that we name beings as, or the thing that governs how we name beings. And I think like you kind of mentioned it already, but like when the baby comes out of the womb and we look at the genital organs and say it's a girl, what's not happening, right, is that we're looking at the genital organs and saying something like it's a human with female characteristics, right? We're not judging the facticity of sex. We are seeing sex as already meaning gender, as already indicating it's the substance that it's supposed to ride on top of it almost. And one more quote. It comes from much later in this chapter. It's from Monique Wittig. And I think it makes it a kind of more brutal sort of attempt at saying this. Sex is taken as a immediate given, a sensible given, physical features belonging to a natural order. But what we believe to be a physical and direct perception is only a sophisticated and mythic construction, an imaginary formation. Yeah. So this is where I think it's very difficult because on the one hand you have to say that they're onto something, because things appear according to our world, according to our language
or our mode of being.
Yeah,
that's Heidegger.
Yeah, I mean we don't ever, we're not liberals. We don't ever get to occupy this objective place within the cosmos. Like we always know as
we're always
vetted.
interpreting the world through meaning already.
Yeah.
You can't, it's not possible to be a neutral observer of facts, because even the facts that you are paying attention to, you chose them because you think that they're relevant, that they're valuable, that they're meaningful.
And I don't think it's particularly helpful to take the Enlightenment position that like somehow we can have this totally disembedded knowledge of the world. And I think that the difficulty is that for the Catholic affirms this, but they affirm it very differently, in the sense that for us, you really can make the actual appearance of things appear differently, but it's not detached from a certain way that you ought to be, the world you ought to be building, and the reality you ought to be perceiving. So what I mean is this, like you can conceive of an extremely sinful society, right, that gets to the point that when they see a woman, say, purely see in the actual like facticity of the body an object of use, and they see nothing else. And on the other side, you can see a very virtuous society developing its language, developing its culture, and seeing that same facticity, and seeing some of the things that we, as Catholics, love to discuss, like the complementarity, right, of the body with the male, or like the sort of transcendent meaning of the body, the spousal meaning of the body, stuff like that. But the point is, what we're not saying is that it's not possible to change the facts that you see on the basis of your habitual being in the world. The world appears to people according to their mode. It's in the mode of the knower, and knowers can be evil and they can be good and they can be habituated in different ways. So this is not relativism, I don't think, because the Catholic is always saying the world that we should be constructing, the facts that we should be revealing, should always be deeper and moving deeper and deeper into reality. Whereas for the postmodern, it's kind of arbitrary, I think.
Yeah. So I think what she's getting at that is that we can only come to know reality through this construction, through our human lens, I suppose. And I think in that the Catholic can be in agreement. Like we come to know things through being human, and part of how we encounter the world is through our language, how we've come to understand things together, and through our particular individual perspective as a human being. Because this is kind of a dumb example, but maybe you take something like a table. The way that a table is going to look to a human being and mean for a human being is going to be something different for a dog. It's going to look different for the dog. It's going to have a different perspective, and it means something different for a dog. It's not the place that we sit at with the family and eat dinner. Table means something different, so to speak.
Yeah.
So we can only come to know the world through our human perspective. And this only ends up being a cynical thing and a bad thing if that means that our perspective can't actually touch reality. If we can't actually know anything about reality.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we start making the opposite turn of the postmodernist. Yes, that's true, but we believe really on the basis of faith that the given world is intelligible because God intended it to be that way.
Yeah, I mean, think about the very term construction. It always means a construction of something, right? So even in the language, the postmoderns are admitting some primary material that is the basis of their construction. They're just saying, well, we're totally alienated from knowing what that is at all. But the Catholic is saying that you can construct the world to be, I mean, we have good constructions or bad constructions, right? We can construct language and habits in our world in order to reveal more and more about the real and the infinite mystery of the gift of creation. Or we can increasingly obscure that by bad constructions that obscure the real. I mean, you can build a peaceful city, you can build a technological slave state, and for the citizens of both cities, reality, the things they think of as facts, are going to actually appear different. Yeah, and I think that's just crucial. And this is and I'm trying to be more careful when I talk about like a Catholic response, but there's a sort of Catholic doctrine. There's been a magisterial, I mean, Pope Francis has definitely said it, defense of the sexual binary that I know Pope Francis has made, and several bishops and groups of bishops have made, saying that sex and gender cannot be detached from each other. Okay, so that admitting some sort of distinction between the facticity of the body and then the cultural interpretation of it, but then saying like, okay, but these things cannot be independent from each other.
Yeah, and it's not actually radically discontinuous.
Yes, which I think is true. But I also want to say I think I understand, because of this, why that's not going to convert the world. It's certainly not going to convert the queer theorists. And the reason is because of what we just said. I mean, they're arguing that the very appearance of facticity of sex is governed by that thing you're calling gender. And gender, that is your cultural world, your cultural interpretation, is actually the thing that's producing its appearance as sex in the first place, as that initial facticity. You know what I mean? So it's the same critique as the critique of liberalism, right? It's saying like, okay, you're saying you found this state of nature, but in fact, your what looks like the state of nature to you is based on this current historical moment, this cultural interpretation of reality. it appears reasonable to you that man began as a naked individual who wandered around the woods, right? But if you
Mm-hmm.
had started somewhere else, that wouldn't have been your state of nature. That's an analogy, like a political analogy to the sexual here. Like
Yeah.
you are saying that you can have this access to facticity, but if it wasn't for your particular cultural expression of it, the habitual modes, the way it's governed by norms, you would not have seen this particular facticity. And so,
So it seems
yeah,
that queer theory is operating at a much deeper level of skepticism, and it seems where when it comes to apologetics for the Christian stance, we can come at it from two ways. And one, dialogue with people who believe that we can come to know reality, that our constructions and or our conceptions of reality and reality itself touch. And if that's true, like if I can trust my sense perception of the world, if I can trust my experience of man and woman,
yeah,
okay, we can move from here further
yeah,
into to dialogue, and I can show you. And here's why it's fitting that what it means to be a man is this, and what it means to be a woman is this. So you can have that level of discourse, and it's awesome. But then for the person who's at a deeper level of skepticism, who doesn't think that construction and reality can touch, or if it does, we sure can't know it.
hmm
Um,
we can only obscure reality. We can't ever illuminate it.
yeah, that kind of discourse isn't going to reach that person.
No, no, I don't think so. Yeah, I think in some ways, and this is not any like professional opinion or anything. It just seems like um, at that point the question needs to be about atheism and about belief and
Mm-hmm.
the cosmos. And as much as we might think the answer is like let's just hit those science books hard, we should probably be hitting like the 5 ways of Aquinas or something,
Yeah.
which doesn't always get its results. But okay, so is that? I mean, that's part 2 of. I mean, I think that pretty much does it. I mean, she at the very end talks about everything we've talked about by saying that this effort to make sex the kind of foundational state of nature thing is to cast it into a pre-discursive domain, and it might be helpful just to know that that's sort of a synonym for everything we've discussed. That like um, what it seems to do to the postmodern is basically arbitrarily and with great power say that this experience is prior to language and prior to
Mm-hmm.
cultural interpretation. But that itself is just an act of power. It's not true.
Yeah. So we can't know sex before gender. Um,
Cool.
so maybe they're just the same thing.
Maybe the same thing. Yeah. Hey, this has been a really long discussion, so we have decided after the fact to split this thing into 2 parts.
That's all.
So this signifies the end of the first part.
Be tuned for next time. Bye.